Now, the next little part of respiration is all about anaerobic respiration, which is basically respiration which takes place in the absence of oxygen. Now, there's several scenarios where there might not be enough oxygen available. Some organisms can respire both anaerobically and aerobically, and some organisms will even just respire anaerobically, depending on where they live and how they're adapted. Now, all the videos in the booklet that we've looked up until now has been all about aerobic respiration. The main advantage of this is that it produces lots and lots of ATP compared to anaerobic respiration, so it makes sense that most organisms will want to try and maximise the levels of aerobic respiration that can take place. So here's a couple of ways that they can do it. Firstly, their heart rate will increase. So imagine you were going for a run. You would basically want more blood containing oxygen and glucose going to your muscles so that you could respire aerobically for as long as possible, because it releases lots of energy. So your heart rate increases. Your breathing rate also increases. So that removes the carbon dioxide in your lungs and brings in more air which has a higher percentage of oxygen. As well as that, there's the Bohr shift. So as you're respiring, you create more carbon dioxide because of respiration. That has the effect of shifting an oxygen dissociation curve for your hemoglobin to the right, which basically means that more oxygen would be released to your respiring tissues. Now, these three steps would allow you to respire aerobically for a little bit longer. The next thing we can think about is what are some advantages of anaerobic respiration. So, if aerobic respiration produces so much ATP in comparison to anaerobic, and our bodies are naturally adapted to try and maximise it, there must be some good reasons why we would use anaerobic respiration. Well, there is, and these are the main ones. It provides extra energy above and beyond what aerobic respiration can provide. Now, what that basically means is it can produce a little bit of extra energy compared to aerobic respiration alone, and we'll get into that one a little bit later. As most muscles respire anaerobically and aerobically at the same time, it provides extra energy above what aerobic respiration alone can provide. And the final thing is, anaerobic respiration is a fast process. It only really involves glycolysis, which takes place in the cytoplasm, so we don't need to wait for substances to diffuse in and out of the mitochondria for it to take place. So, the advantage is that it's a fast process because there's only the steps in glycolysis which we're relying on to produce ATP. Now, this diagram is going to show you the main pathways in aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So, this line basically separates aerobic conditions from anaerobic conditions. So let's look at what we know. Well, we know that glucose will get broken down into pyruvate in the process of glycolysis. In normal conditions where oxygen is available, the pyruvate will then go into the link reaction and then the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. Now, when oxygen is available, it's the final hydrogen acceptor. It'll come along, pick up the hydrogen atoms and form water. But what also happens along the way is NAD picks up hydrogen and forms reduced NAD. Now, let's say for example, there's no oxygen available. Basically, even though it's used at the very end, it stops the electron transport chain and it stops the Krebs cycle. So all we really get is glucose being broken down to pyruvate and then all this reduced NAD forming. Now, the reduced NAD formed down at this step. So once we've got the reduced NAD, it allows us to produce more ATP. But the problem is, if we get this buildup of reduced NAD, it means that we can't get any ATP produced. So we actually need to somehow regenerate this NAD. And that's where anaerobic respiration comes in. Now, we can look at anaerobic respiration in animal tissue and plants and yeast. And in each case, both of them have different products, but they basically carry out the same process. So in animal tissue, the pyruvate gets converted into lactic acid or lactate, and this lactic acid, it's quite painful in your muscles. It makes them cramp up. So at the end of anaerobic respiration, it's converted back to pyruvate when the oxygen becomes available again. Whereas in plants and yeast, the pyruvate gets converted into ethanol and carbon dioxide. But the difference is the ethanol does not get converted back to pyruvate, so it needs to be removed as a waste product. Now, as I say, if this reduced NAD builds up, we can't get ATP later on. So what we need to do is somehow try and oxidize this NAD. So what happens here is, as the pyruvate is getting converted back to lactic acid, the reduced NAD gives up the hydrogens that it picked up and it becomes this oxidized NAD. That means that the NAD is free to go back here, pick up more hydrogen and allow the ATP production to continue. Now, ATP production will only happen at this stage, only at the end of glycolysis. Now, the same thing also happens in plants and yeast. So this reduced NAD, we need to somehow get rid of its hydrogen, so the pyruvate gets converted to ethanol. When that happens, the reduced NAD gives up its hydrogen, becomes reoxidized. It can go back and it can pick up more hydrogens so that we can get more ATP produced. So the only bit that can really take place in anaerobic conditions is this process, glycolysis, which is where we have the glucose being broken down into pyruvate, the NAD becoming reduced, and a little bit of ATP being formed. Now you might be thinking straight away, well flip, that's great, we've got some ATP, but remember, in aerobic respiration, per glucose we got 38 ATPs, but in anaerobic, we're only going to get 2 ATPs, because remember, 2 ATP get used up here, and 4 get produced at the end, so we only get 2 ATP net produced. So it's actually not very much, but we'll talk about why it's so important that it happens in a minute. Now, just to give you a little bit more detail about this conversion from pyruvate to lactic acid, you can see here that the conversion of pyruvate to lactic acid allows more NAD to become reoxidized, which means it can go and accept more hydrogen atoms so glycolysis can continue. So for the chemists among you, if you've got pyruvate and lactate, the difference here is that this here, I know this is not the way we've seen it, but this is the reduced NAD. It gives up its hydrogen and forms this oxidized NAD, which can then go back into glycolysis and pick up more hydrogen. When it gives up its hydrogen, it forms lactate or lactic acid. And what you'll notice here in the chemical structure of pyruvate and lactic acid, the only difference between them is lactic acid has 2 extra hydrogens. So this double bond in pyruvate split open and it's now able to accept more hydrogens. So instead of these hydrogens floating about, they basically produce this lactic acid. Now, in animals, it can't go on forever because lactic acid makes your muscles tire very quickly and it also leads to cramping. So we can only rely on anaerobic respiration for a short period of time. Now say you had to explain that in a question. How does production of lactate allow glycolysis to continue? The conversion of pyruvate to lactate regenerates NAD, or you could say it reoxidizes NAD. This allows dehydrogenation in glycolysis to continue, which means ATP can be produced. But the negative side, it means lactate or lactic acid will build up. Now, the only last bit of detail to add in is this process of converting pyruvate to lactic acid is catalyzed by the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase. And in plants and yeast, that process is catalyzed by alcohol dehydrogenase. Now, once this lactate or lactic acid has built up in muscles, it's important that it gets removed again because it is actually a waste product of respiration. So it actually gets removed at the end of exercise. So the lactate is removed by being oxidized back to pyruvate when sufficient oxygen becomes available again. So it loses hydrogen. So at the end of anaerobic respiration, when we've got lactate, which has these extra hydrogens, it gets converted back to pyruvate, and for that to take place, it loses these hydrogens and becomes oxidized again. Now, earlier on, we said that it was catalyzed by the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase. Lactate dehydrogenase actually catalyzes both the forwards and reverse reactions. So lactate dehydrogenase catalyzes the reaction of lactate being converted back to pyruvate. The pyruvate then can continue along the link reaction, then Krebs, and at the end of exercise, the extra oxygen which was used to convert the lactate back to pyruvate is called the oxygen debt, and that's shown in this little graph. So here we're at rest. This point is the start of exercise. Then your oxygen usage increases, and that's because at this point you're increasing your levels of activity, so you need more energy, and to do that you need to increase your levels of respiration. Now your oxygen usage stops around here. Well, it levels off around here. You're still using a lot of oxygen, so probably around this point that's when you're respiring anaerobically, because you just can't absorb and use any more oxygen. So then it only carries on for a short period of time and you stop exercising here. Now your oxygen usage still remains high, but this is your oxygen debt. So it's the oxygen required at the end of exercise to convert the lactate back to pyruvate. So that's why if you went for a run for like 20 minutes or so, and at the end of it you were very out of breath, you would continually breathe deeply and quickly for a couple of minutes afterwards. It's because you're paying back the oxygen debt. So what that basically means is that while you were running, you were respiring anaerobically, you were producing lactate. Once you're finished exercise, you want to get rid of that lactate, and you do that by breathing deeply and quickly, and that's paying back the oxygen debt. The extra oxygen is also used to resynthesize any ATP which you've used up during exercise. Now, if we were comparing anaerobic respiration in plants and animals, a lot of plants and animals live in soil or other oxygen deficient areas, so the ability to respire anaerobically allows them to maintain their ATP production even though they live in areas where there is less oxygen. So the lower ATP yield is not as significant in plants as they are less metabolically active. So what we basically mean here is that most animals will have to respire aerobically because they can move about more and they're more metabolically active, whereas for plants and fungi, because they're generally stationary and less metabolically active, they don't mind that they only get less ATP from anaerobic respiration, and in fact it allows them to survive. So even though they're producing way less ATP, it's still enough to allow them to survive and carry out their main processes. And then this is sort of just going into a little bit more detail of what we talked about whenever we had mentioned about producing ATP in aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So the only process that can take place in anaerobic respiration was glycolysis, and that ATP is produced by substrate level phosphorylation. Now, I should note here that it's 2 ATP, and that is 2 ATP net production, because remember, in glycolysis 2 ATP were used at the start, 4 were produced at the end. So 4 minus 2 equals 2 ATP produced. Whereas aerobic respiration produced 38 molecules of ATP per glucose. And that's pretty much the end of anaerobic respiration.